Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. As working mothers, we all know from personal experience how challenging it is to balance our careers with our personal lives. And researchers from the University of Manchester and the University of Essex discovered that working mothers are 40% more stressed than women who have no children and who are also working full time. And that research was conducted before the pandemic hit our lives. That intersection between our work, motherhood and our lives is such a powerful one. The balance or blend between them has such a profound implications for our well-being. And that's why I'm so excited to be joined by today's guest to share her insights on well-being. And she's someone that I've wanted to get on the podcast for a little while now after discovering her work. Today, I'm joined by Audrey McGibbon from Australia. Audrey is a psychologist, a business leader, a well-being expert, and the co-creator of the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey. The Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey is specifically designed to explore the well-being of leaders in the workplace, taking account of the roles, context, demands and situations experienced by this population. And I love this tool. I've never come across something that captures the demands and insights for us as working mums so powerfully. Audrey is truly a world-leading expert on well-being. And as a working mum herself, she's got some incredible expertise, experience and insights that I think you're going to love. So if you're a working mum who identifies with being a leader in the workplace, you're not going to want to miss out on what Audrey has got to share in this episode. She talks about how her work as an occupational psychologist and an executive coach, working with executives, with how she terms it no fuel in the tank, led her to specialise in well-being. She talked about those of us who are particularly driven are more vulnerable to burnout as we don't know when or how to stop, and we don't do the maintenance needed to kind of sustain our well-being. She shared that often we mistake well-being for our physical wellness, and actually it's far more than that. And she's got some particular insights into well-being as a result of COVID, such as the number of people thriving has now halved. I mean, that's a huge number. And that we're yet to know if the number of people languishing has increased, that there's almost a lag time that we're going to find out actually the impact of COVID on us. She talks about that emotional agility, which is often seen as a good thing, isn't always a good thing for our resilience. And she shares more about that. She's got some fascinating insights into burnout and depletion. And she shares some brilliant coping and prevention strategies that are really practical. And I love how she shared about this concept of building well-being into our households, because often we kind of say what we should be doing, but we're not always doing what we say. And the importance of leadership casting a well-being shadow at work, and what we prioritise is what we influence others around us. And that's just as important in our homes. And she also shared this concept of destructive passion, that we can get so into something, whether it be our work, our family, that it actually feels wrong not to be doing it all the time. And just because we love doing it doesn't mean that we should always be doing it, that we can actually have too much of a good thing. Oh, that's just kind of a small insight into all the goodness that Audrey shared. I'm not going to keep you any longer though. Let's dive into this fascinating topic and welcome Audrey. So welcome Audrey. Thank you so much for joining me on the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show. I'm delighted to have you here.
I'm very pleased to be here, Nikki. I'm sorry it's taken a while.
No, and I'm more than happy to be getting up at early in the morning to record this with the time zone difference, because obviously you're based over in Australia. So I was like, whenever we can make this happen, I want to make it happen. So you describe yourself as an executive coach and wellbeing expert, and I'd love for you to kind of give an insight into my listeners into the work that you do. Would you mind sharing that, please?
Sure, no problem. It's interesting. These days, I think I know I'm doing much less one-on-one individual executive coaching work, and the whole well-being side has ramped up And in terms of insight into what I do, I am working increasingly with leaders and their teams and whole organizations, trying to help them crack this growing challenge around the elusive balance, and trying to help them make progress both with building up individuals' attributes and effective coping strategies, but also increasingly holding organizations to account on their part. There's an expression we talk about in the wellbeing side of things where we say you need to look at both the seed and the soil. And for too many years, really, it's been almost a sense of victim blaming that, if you're burnt out or tired or stressed or overwhelmed, there's something that's deficit in you as an individual for not being able to cope. And so we're really challenging a lot of those aspects. I also don't want it to just become all the organization's fault, because that's equally simplistic. And, right at the heart of well-being, what I'm discovering and have been focusing on for years is it's a far harder, more complex, nuanced issue than people tend to think.
Amazing. And I think that's...
Sorry, does that give you a good enough feel?
It does. And I love that you're talking to almost the systemic piece of this. It's, it isn't as simple. There's the organizational systems and all of the other systems we kind of belong to that make this such a powerful but tricky kind of subject.
Yeah, that's right. And, when I had worked as an organizational psychologist or an occupational psychologist and leadership development consultant, doing a lot of executive coaching, but I really just had this bugbear around why are so many people doing it tough? And what can I do to support them? And that's what got me into the wellbeing space. And so my work was predominantly working with individuals. But that's going back to sort of 2013, 14, 15. And really since then, the more data that we're amassing in the process of trying to help support individuals, the more evidence we're gathering that is helpful for organizations to understand what their part in the solution is. So, yeah, it's evolving.
And now more than ever, the work that you're doing is so needed. So obviously we're talking about well-being, and I think it's a topic and a word that we use a lot in our language, but I think it can often be used in different ways. So can you share what your definition of well-being is, please, and kind of your perspective on it?
Yeah, you're raising something really important there, because one of the challenges that gives rise to the confusion that we've just been talking about whose responsibility is it and how do you fix it, is that we don't really operate from a shared understanding about what it is. So in the space that I'm in, which is very much working with professionals, with adults who are in the world of work and in the world of living, well-being means something really quite different from if we were working with unemployed adults or the populations in war-torn countries without access to food, health, water. So I think that is a really important distinction, and it gives us perspective on how variable well-being can be depending upon the individual's needs and circumstances. And I just happen to specialize in the area where the circumstances are employed, usually in pretty complex, challenging roles that have a lot of responsibility. So it's subjective is the bottom line on that one. The other attributes that I think are really important to capture about well-being is to make sure that you have a broad enough concept of what it is that it's about. For some people, immediately springs to mind things like smoking cessation programs, yoga, step counts, doing team marathon runs and so on. And so it's very physically oriented. But I'm sure that you can all think of people who are physically, fit as a flea, and yet who don't emanate that sense of whatever this magic well-being is. So it is possible to be physically healthy without having high levels of well-being. And so implicit in that is that well-being has a much broader feel to it. And that's really where we've been focusing a lot of our research since 2015. And we know that well-being includes the physical health, sleep, diet, exercise, movement, rest, recovery. And we know that it includes the mental health from a resilience, what's going on with your emotions, what's happening with your anxiety, what's happening with your moods and sense of stability, or the word that we use is your equanimity. But, you can push for resilience all you want, and you could be an extremely resilient individual with high levels of physical health. And does that necessarily mean that you feel like you're flourishing and living your best life? No, don't think so. So they're important, but there's more to it again. And so just to fill out the sort of the other bits, well-being is about the sweet spot that we have where all of the challenges that are coming at us in life are not too much for the resources that we have available at our disposal to meet those challenges. And being resilient and healthy are great resources, but equally so is having fantastic social support through your work, but also outside of work. And so is having a very strong sense of purpose and an understanding of, well, if your life's to be successful, what's important to you? What really matters? So, what's your life force when you get up every day? Why are you doing what you're doing? So that sense of meaning and purpose. And, a one that I'm sure most of your listeners will completely relate to is that notion of balance.
Yes.
And we've long ago given up on the sort of overly simplistic notion of work-life balance.
Yeah.
It's really around this balancing between all of the roles and responsibilities and issues and challenges that are on our plates with our capacity to attend to the priorities. So we sort of, we talk about balance and boundaries there, yin and yang, or, both parts of the system. And the last one that we really emphasize is for those people who are in, the bigger, more complex roles. They're frequently very well qualified, tertiary experienced. One of the most insidious things that they can face is being in a role that is boring to them, which is understimulating from an intellectual engagement and flow perspective. They're underutilized. Now, very few people these days have the luxury of saying they're bored in terms of not having enough to do, but we do differentiate between qualitative overload and underload, and quantitative overload and underload. So these days, to take all that jargon out, we have lots of people who are overworked in terms of volume of challenges, but potentially underworked in terms of their love and interest and engagement in what they're doing. So that wasn't a short answer to what is well-being, but there you are. Multiple dimensions, dynamic shifts, subjective, and you got to look at it in work and outside of work.
It wasn't a short, but it was beautiful. I'm like, oh, there's so many directions that we could go in with that. But I also wanted to just touch on the fact that you talk about performance and well-being and how they have this kind of symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. So it just struck me that I think one of the myths or the fundamental misunderstandings about well-being is that it's something that you sacrifice or have to sacrifice in order to climb the greasy pole of career progression, or even just to deliver high levels of performance in the role that you're in. So it's certainly not unusual, is it, to hear of people sacrificing their sleep or some family time or working longer, harder, putting up with stuff that they really don't want to put up with, but they're doing it because they believe that it's what's expected and needed in order to be successful. And what the data shows is the opposite. The data shows that people who manage their well-being and prioritize self-care and who attend to their physiological, psychological, emotional needs, they're the ones that will have the sustainable success over the long run.
Yes.
And, it's hand in hand with the discussions around burnout and each of us having a threshold that we're continually butting up against. So timing is a factor here as well, Nikki. So, it sounds ridiculous, and I wouldn't argue that there aren't times where we have to pull out all the stops and work long hours. The point is that a conscious, purposeful, intentional choice linked to a clearly identified, valid priority? Or are you doing it because it's become your default?
Yeah.
Or are you doing it because you feel like you're trying to keep other people happy? And the only way that they can do that is by doing these really long hours.
Yes, because I relate to a lot of my client base, and I can relate to this person as well. They kind of the over functioners, over deliver, overwork, over give, over feel overly responsible, and that can really impact well-being. This episode is supported by Woohoo You, my favourite place to go to show the people in my life how much they mean to me. If you're anything like me, I love giving gifts and want them to be heartfelt and meaningful. But as a busy working mum, I struggle to find the time to search for that perfect gift. That was until I discovered Woohoo You. When you give a woohoo, you're giving a personalised gift like no other. A beautiful book that's full of love and appreciation with personal messages from all the people who know the recipient best. A woohoo brings people together. It's an amazing thing to give as well as receive, and it's more than just a beautiful gift. Woohoo You is based on the psychology of gratitude and appreciation, and it was created by 2 psychologist colleagues of mine who I deeply respect, so more people could share what they love most about someone important, and so these special people might realise just how valued they are. How amazing is that? It's the perfect gift for those special occasions. A birthday or a retirement, a leaving present, Mother or Father's Day, getting married, or just because you want someone to know how much they mean to you. Why settle for the same old presents when you could give something that's meaningful and will be remembered forever? Why not give a woohoo? Head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk/woohoo. That's WOOHOO. And you can check out all the details at wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk/woohoo. And I know you're going to love it.
Yeah, and there's some new stuff coming through around how, despite how extremely distressing anxiety, like diagnosed anxiety can be, the number of people who are what we regard as very high functioning with high anxiety is, it's a significant proportion. And of course, that links back to your whole piece around high achieving, perfectionistic, controlling, type A's, they used to be called in the day, but very driven people are often very anxious because some level of stress actually enhances our performance. But we're getting worse and worse as a human race at knowing how to shift down some gears. And I think a lot of people are just staying in overdrive and staying in top gear, and it's really not necessary. But they're knowing no different. It's not unusual to hear people feeling that they, not only can they not switch off, but they feel guilty even at the prospect of trying to switch off.
Yeah, and I know so many people listening will relate to that. So obviously here on this podcast, we're talking about working mums. And I know obviously a lot of your work is with senior leaders and these large organizations. And I'm wondering, what are you hearing and experiencing within your clients around working mothers and their well-being at the moment?
I think one of the things I'm really quite scrupulous about at the moment is making sure we're not speculating about what's going on, because I don't think that's helpful to anyone. So truth be told, Nikki, it's relatively early days, and the studies, the reputable, reliable, big studies that have been done are predominantly in professions and roles unique to the health sector and caring roles. There's far, far less done on general employee impacts. There are some. So I've got some themes I can share. But one of the things that I think I would preface it with is that even before the pandemic, what we knew about differences between um, uh, those in carer roles and the differences between women in the workforce and men in the workforce from a well-being perspective is that there are actually comparatively few differences between men and women's well-being overall. However, the differences that do exist are unfortunately entirely predictable and somewhat depressing. So, if I give you some examples of that, in the workplace, when we look at the extent to which people report good levels of feeling supported and trusted and recognized and respected. So you're treated socially at work in the way that you would like to be treated. The genders are the same, and there used to be certainly a plus for women that outside of work. They would report higher levels of social well-being in their personal and family lives than men did. And, that's somewhat stereotypical because women, I think, are regarded as being better overall at nurturing relationships. I do just urge a word of caution here, because when we're talking about these group trends, as a psychologist that focuses on individuals, that's how I was brought up as a psychologist. I'm always really nervous to stress that the individual's well-being profile trumps always, much more significant than these group trends. But, so socially, there's actually very little difference, and women tend to win, if I can put it like that, on an outside of work perspective. The resilience piece, the data that we have fully supports the prevailing notion that men see themselves as much more resilient than women do, both inside of work and outside of work. And that is statistically significant to the highest possible level. And it's based on sample sizes that run into the thousands. Women tend to look after themselves better from a physical perspective in the workplace, so they eat less rubbishy lunches, they keep well hydrated, they tend not to drink as much coffee on average. So those sorts of differences existed pre-COVID, and as did the one where males on average had far better balance and boundaries in place in their lives than women. And to get to the point of your question around, so what's shifted is the differences that we had been seeing have become more, the gap has got bigger again. It's a difficult thing to measure, but last year, right at the start of COVID, or actually right before COVID, I was lucky enough to be able to work with a group of 100 women who we profiled. So we had, 126 responses by 100 women. So that's quite a big data set. And then they went into lockdown in Australia, or parts of Australia, and nothing happened on that project. And so 6 months later, when we were sort of coming back to life, the same group of women took the survey again. So I'd love to claim that this was a really intentional experimental design. Very good luck from my point of view. Not that I would say COVID's lucky for anyone, but you know what I mean. We've got to take the silver linings. And so I had this 100 women before they'd experienced COVID, and then 6 months later, after living in the world with COVID, and some of, a big proportion of them would actually have been in lockdown for a significant period. And what we saw was, I think it was a 7 point something percent increase in their sense of feeling at risk of burnout. And the caveat there is that pre-COVID, the world was already in a heightened state of burnout. It's not, and I think that's been lost a little bit. It's not like we came into COVID with our tanks filled to the brim with fuel that's going to sustain us. We were on our knees, really have been since the global financial crisis, which was kind of why I got into this whole space. The World Health Organization announced an epidemic of stress in May 2019 for employees. So burnout is a uniquely work-related phenomenon. And so they'd already declared that, and then that just got overshadowed totally. So I do sort of think, we were already doing it tough. Women were already doing it tough. Those with children were doing it tougher again, pre-pandemic. And then this data that we have has illustrated that their boundaries have eroded significantly again. Their risk of burnout has increased. And the other one, which I think has got massive talent implications, is that women are reporting a drop in the sense of meaning and purpose that they derive from their work in the region of 8% within 6 months. Now, it's the same group of women in the same roles in the same organization. So that is pretty significant. I just haven't had time to write that up or get it published or have anybody check it out and look at it. What I don't know, but I also suspect, is that men too are reporting a higher level of, or sorry, a drop in their meaning and purpose. And I think it's this piece around boundaries. So we're actually seeing in this country what I'm referring to as the first group of fathers experiencing mother's guilt. Um, they're coming back into the workplace, and we're hearing about very senior men who are really grieving what the cost is to them now that they're now aware of coming back into the office environment and what they're giving up to be there. So it's a fascinating space.
Absolutely. And, one that you're so well positioned. Just hearing you talk, Audrey, is just amazing, because I hear a real balance, a real passion for not making assumptions, that really looking into the data. And that's just amazing to hear. So
Thank you.
How I came across you and your work was through your Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey, which you co-created. And this is all about measuring a leader's wellbeing in the workplace. And I wondered if you could share how you came to create this. You've given us some insights already, kind of as to some of the breadcrumbs that led there. Would you mind just sharing a bit more about it and how it works?
I would be very happy to, because it's sort of become our baby. I didn't realize at the time what we were doing. So it goes back to that sort of epiphany, conscious sort of awareness of, hang on a minute, I can't actually keep peddling my wares as an executive coach doing this stuff, because the people that I'm supposed to be trying to support with their, strategic coaching goals, they actually just got no fuel in the tank. And this is going back to, it was post GFC and all the way throughout the global financial crisis. My coaching business had sort of gone up the way because I was supporting leaders who were, finding conditions pretty tough. And so that struck me as quite sensible. I'd sort of expected that. But what I didn't expect was, in the post-global financial crisis world, that those stress levels wouldn't abate. I thought they would sort of recalibrate to something approximating, what I'd seen in the early parts of my career, where it really would just be the 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, 1 in 7 who were notably struggling. But that was not the case. It would be, 2 or 3 in 5 who were dealing with stuff that was detracting then from their ability to be optimally productive and energized and perform at their best. And maybe only just 1 in 5 who would hit that kind of space that we refer to as thriving and flourishing. And I thought, well, that's the issue. That's what I think I need to try and help with. And I thought it would be easy enough to go and find a tool, because my background in my early career had been working, I don't know if I'm allowed to say company names, but I'd worked with a company called Savill & Holdsworth, or SHL, in the UK, and I'd been involved in a lot of psychometric test development. And so I had just sort of assumed that when I went looking for a good, credible measure of well-being that I could use with professionals and leaders who've got a bit of work experience, that there would be something there. And there wasn't something that I felt I could use with my clients. There was some really good medical stuff, but it was too medical. And this is not about diagnosing mental ill health. There's a world of difference between the clinical tools that are, meeting your criteria in the DSMI, which is the classification of mental ill health symptoms. So that's not what we do. I wanted to bring the whole challenge much further up the curve and make it more proactive and preventative, and start the education process a lot earlier. So I couldn't find the tool. So I went back to school. I went back and did my master's in psychotherapy through Sheffield University, and my lovely colleague and sadly now retired business partner, Karen Gillespie, she went off and did a postgrad in wellness. And we created what we thought was just going to be a little bit of a quick and dirty diagnostic for use in just our own coaching practice. That was the extent of our aspirations back in 2015. And I did my master's research using that little, well, it wasn't so little, but it was certainly quite an ugly survey and reporting system. And I think, as the saying goes, it's become the tail that wags the dog. So it just spread by word of mouth. And so that survey it asks people to reflect on stuff that you wouldn't typically take time out to think about in a structured way. And we actually know even the experience of completing the survey is reported by the majority of respondents before they've even seen the results or had a debrief or any coaching. Just the process of reflecting on the items that we have in there. Items, fancy word for questions. That brings some therapeutic benefit, some catharsis, and also some structure to helping them examine what's going well for them and supporting them in their work, and what's going well for them and supporting them outside of work, and of course what the pinch points are as well. So that's what we've created. It takes about 10-15 minutes to complete. It's all online. And of course, we've well and truly hit the digital era, and where you guys over in Europe were much more advanced about your data protection and privacy. So we had to incorporate all that. I know more about technology now than I ever wanted to. I hate it, but we had to do it. It was a necessary part of it. So we created it just as this little it was an Excel spreadsheet, and it wasn't even as sophisticated as a SurveyMonkey when it first started. And then as other clients and some lovely coaching colleagues said, oh, can we use it too? We begged and borrowed from some beautiful colleagues who said, oh, we can help you pretty that up a bit. And then over the years, we now have it it's very schmick. And that is appropriate, because one of the challenges we have is getting leaders and professionals to take this stuff seriously. Because I think there's still this myth that well-being is for the weak or the needy or the vulnerable, the people who are struggling. It's like, hang on a minute. If you're a human being, you have well-being needs. You are not invincible. You are not a machine. And in fact, even machines have a breaking point. And we all have a breaking point. And those that are particularly driven are probably even more vulnerable to reaching that breaking point, because they don't know how to stop. They don't take breaks. They don't do maintenance on themselves as much as they should do. And it's all well-intentioned, because they're just trying to strive to add value to help, whether it's help families and their children or help their employers. But it's that piece that you mentioned, Nikki. It's about giving. Giving. Do. Somebody's asked for it, therefore I have to do it, and not just do it, but do it brilliantly, so that I can avoid any criticism or sense of them thinking I'm not up to the role, because of course imposter syndrome is alive and well, particularly for women.
Yes, and the tool you've created is phenomenal. In my career, I've done a lot of these tools and psychometrics, and when I came across this, I just love everything about it. I think the fact that you've split it into working well and living well, and how those kind of that relationship between the two, and then you've got, as you said, the 6 areas around authentic relationships: meaning, purpose and direction, resilience and equanimity, vitality and energy, balance and boundaries, and this intellectual engagement and flow. When I completed it and had my results, I gained so much from it that I wasn't expecting, because I work in this space. I like to think I've got a pretty high level of self-awareness, and I was like, oh, this is really good. So I love what you've put together.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to hear. It's very, very, very rewarding to be doing this. And we now have, I think it's something like 450 accredited coaches and consultants and in-house wellbeing leadership development specialists in organizations around the world. I mean, we've recently accredited someone in Greece, Poland, India. We've got Canada. We've got lots in the US, New Zealand, quite a few people in the UK. It's extremely gratifying to think that, this has just come from a little, literally it was peer supervision with my business partner, Karen, and we're like, we got to do something, but we did it for ourselves. And to think that it's happening out there at scale, it is very rewarding.
And I also, over the pandemic, watching the work that you put out, looking through the lens of each of these kind of areas, and you put together some brilliant reports kind of looking through the lens of resilience and equanimity, and I just found what you put out so brilliant, because it was, again, it wasn't speculation. You were using data. So I would encourage people to actually, when we come to the end, I know you're going to share your website and contact details for people to take a look at some of the stuff that you've put together around that as well, because there was so much rich data in that.
Thank you.
I wanted to say congratulations on starting your PhD. I love a woman who learns.
Or commiserations.
So you're doing a PhD in organisational psychology with the University of London, is that right?
Yeah, through Birkbeck College and the marvellous team there that are leading the way in future of work and particularly in leader burnout, well-being. So it's right up my alleyway, and I've had my eye on this for a long, long time. So I was just waiting for my little one to finish school this year. I can't believe that. I've got my last one through school. So bit of time to focus on my own studies rather than hers.
Yes. Oh, congratulations. And what a lovely thing to do, actually. You're just reclaiming some space back for you to do something you wanted to do. So I know that I saw that you recently shared that you had put in an academic proposal and it had given you some insights into burnout that you've been exploring. Could you share a little bit about what you believe the current state of play is around burnout?
I would be happy to. I mean, I think we do need some more information around it. I'm just laughing because, this is a clear case of physician heal thyself. I mean, one of our biggest risks in this whole space is that we just sort of bite off more than we can chew, and I am extremely guilty of that. So it's still going back to the PhD for a minute, Nikki. I'm still debating whether should I have reclaimed my time for my own studies on the PhD, or should I have taken a gap year? Now, if the borders had been open and we Australians were allowed to leave our country, then I would undoubtedly, I think, plump for a gap year. But if Birkbeck College happened to be hearing this, I am still deeply committed to my PhD.
But you raise a really interesting point there, Audrey, because we can talk about this in terms of an intellectual, this is what we should be doing, but actually living and breathing it and actually applying it in our own lives can often be the most challenging piece of this.
Most definitely. I do feel quite a heavy responsibility, not to be well. I mean, there's certain stuff I just can't control there, but I'm extremely mindful about what I put out into the world, and I don't hold myself out in any sense to be, perfect, but I'm a work in progress. And I think one of the things that I would be urging for anyone listening is to think about, well, if you want your children to be growing up well-adjusted and with the skills and strategies to cope and to prioritize and be sensible about themselves, if you want your children to really look after themselves and treat them as the precious human beings that you know them to be, are you also demonstrating that to them? Are you practicing what you preach? So for everyone listening in that is kind of got a lot or has got a lot on their plates, I think one of the things that we can try and do is even starting with building a wellbeing community in our own households where we prioritize and commit and put actions around the stuff that we say is important. So whether that's getting your kids off their devices or, eating healthily or, doing the exercise or getting to bed on time, you and your behaviors we talk about casting a well-being shadow in the workplace, a leadership well-being shadow. But, what you say and do and what you prioritize and what you measure as success is what will influence the people in your teams and the people in your home team. So your kids or your partners or your, friends and relatives that have an insight into how you're leading your life. So if you can't do self-care for yourself, then I sort of find it helpful myself to think about, well, I need to do this and I want to do it for other people. And sometimes, sadly, that is still a more powerful, easier motivation for me, is to do it because it's the right thing to do for others. Sometimes it still feels like a guilty indulgence. But there's lots more I could go on about there. Maybe we'll come back to it later. You asked me about burnout. Nikki, I haven't forgotten that question and what the current state is of burnout. Okay, so a bit like well-being, actually, burnout is also a term that's being used and bandied around a lot. And so one of the things I think that is reflective of the current state is that when the layperson talks about burnout, it's not necessarily what the published literature and research is meaning by burnout. So there are three conditions that are characteristic of a true burnout. And that's not to diminish those people who are using it as a synonym, is that the right word? As an alternative to saying I'm feeling really overloaded here or I'm tired. But burnout is that state of complete emotional and physical exhaustion that unfolds over a period of time. And going back to the high achieving, driven professional people in big roles, their risk of reaching that state of complete depletion is higher because they're marvelously, brilliantly adept at divorcing their thinking, task-driven brain from the part of the brain that looks after our emotions and physiological needs and our need to stand up and move or our need to go and have a drink of water. They just plow through, persevere. Yes, I know I'm hungry, but I just have to get this email out. Yes, I know this is happening, but I just have to do that. Those are the stories that they tell. And you can keep going like that and go and go and go and go and go, except one day, you can't do it anymore and you're exhausted. And it's a really complex area and it's not my space, but it might be quite interesting for you to understand that when we experience pain in the body and we have sore knees or sore legs or sore arms, the pain receptors give us that immediate feedback. So if you're already got an injury in your knee and then you try to exercise on it again before you're ready, you get pretty fast feedback that that's actually not okay. And you kind of take steps to alleviate it and recover appropriately. The brain doesn't work like that. The mind doesn't work like that. The mind doesn't have nearly as sophisticated pain receptors. So the lag effect between us hurting our brains and us being aware of hurting, being sort of mindfully aware of struggling, the lag effect is quite significant. And we really only experience it as this diffuse sense of what's often referred to as brain fog, or I sort of describe it, it's a bit like feeling you've got a jet lag or a hangover, except there's no reason to be jet lagged or hungover. So that complete state of exhaustion that takes a long time to get there, but when you're there, you're depleted. The next thing that is associated, so the second of the three conditions, is about becoming increasingly and uncharacteristically detached, emotionally detached from your work. So you might have gone from going, oh my God, I love my job. It's so good. I'm on fire. It's so interesting. But you push and you push and you push and you push and you don't switch off and you don't have your boundaries until the point where you think, actually, I just can't do this anymore. I know this is really important, but I just don't care. And when you reach that stage of not caring, that's where the third characteristic comes to the front, And that's where we start to see a loss of performance because your judgment starts to get a bit wobbly. You make some decisions that you wouldn't make if you were not as exhausted and cynical and negative about things. And maybe if you still cared some more. So you start to make some pretty ropey judgment calls, or just your creativity is gone. So the thing that might have got you promoted or into this great job, the very qualities that have contributed to you being successful, they start to disappear on you. It's very hard to be agile and innovative and collaborative and a disruptor when you're, chronically sleep deprived, and exhausted and irritable. So, but it's not altogether surprising. But that's the package. So those three conditions of utter exhaustion, increasing cynicism, detachment, negativity in feelings about and towards your job, and then your performance starts to go down, and you usually have some good awareness of that, particularly if you've been a high achiever. So your confidence drops, and we're well into what's described as the downward spiral or the vicious circle. We might just pause there for a moment, Nikki, see where you want to take this next. I obviously can just carry on talking.
No, and I love how you clarify that. And I suppose I'm interested in, given the academic proposal that you've put together. So you've been researching this, I suppose, very recently, I'm assuming. What are you understanding about the current state of play with burnout, given the context of the pandemic? Are you hearing or picking up any new data that kind of takes us from where we were pre-pandemic?
Look, it is still early days. There's the stuff I was talking about earlier, where we know for the same group of women, it was a 7.1% increase in their self-perceived risk of burnout over 6 months. Burnout was already high for the general working population of professional women previously. So that is an increase that we can ill afford. But when you put that in the context of a drop in sense of fulfillment, meaning and purpose that you get from your work, then the emotional toll or the cost of that increased burnout becomes higher again. So I think that's one angle I'd like to pursue. And I should clarify, I haven't yet got my hypothesis, if that's what you're driving at, Nikki. I don't have okay, so this is what I'm going to answer. There's so many interesting strands to pursue. I think the other construct that I have alluded to is this notion of what's called destructive passion, where you can be so into your job or so into your family, it's really genuinely something that you care an awful lot about, and it feels wrong to you to not be doing it all of the time. So from a meaning and purpose, it might really be rewarding, but you can have too much of a bad thing. And then it's about stepping back and viewing, well, what do you want to achieve over the course of your lifetime, over the course of your professional career, and over the course of your identity as a mother, a loving partner, a daughter, a sister? What does success look like for you there? Because when you're in the throes of this destructive passion, because passion is usually talked about is such a positive, and it is from an engagement and purpose point of view. But when you put self-care into that, notwithstanding that meaning and purpose and engagement are part of what creates high well-being, but it doesn't make it sustainable. And so I think that's another really interesting angle. What's the intersection between, a sustainable level of passion and interest and desire to pursue the things that, whether it's professionally or personally, that you're interested in?
Absolutely. And it's just making me think that actually from my clients that I work with, what I often find is you've got these highly professional, ambitious women that have kind of flourished in their careers, and then they add motherhood into the mix. And clearly that's a transition that can be difficult, but then they try and apply the same approach to their careers with this now additional part of their life. And that's where it becomes unsustainable. And you add in, you talked about depletion earlier, that so many women have almost that postnatal depletion, but are then going back into the workforce, trying to work in the same way. And you get this kind of perfect storm of something needs to change to make this sustainable. But what I've always done, has made me successful. And that's part of my identity. How do I make those changes? And so that's the kind of context that I suppose I probably work in with my clients. And then we've added in the pandemic. And as you've talked about, those balance and boundaries got compromised even more. And just hearing the conversations with my clients around, as we're coming out of this pandemic, they're feeling like they should now start to, it's nearly over. I should start to return to whatever, we talk about normal. And there's just this deep sense of further depletion.
That's right. So, I mean, we have been so fortunate overall here in Australia, in terms of our COVID experience in comparison to yours in the UK, Nikki. But that also means that we're ahead of the curve in terms of the experience of what the return to office, which is averaging out, on a hybrid basis, and what that's like, and some of the adjustments. I have a really esteemed colleague, Kate Connors, who refers to this as we've got emotional whiplash, because the rules keep changing so often. And in the UK, you will no doubt relate to that. It's fine and well to be emotionally agile, but agile to the point of hyper-flexibility, hyper-extension, and whiplash is not a good thing. So I actually think we've got an emerging body of research to be done in psychology around challenging all of the things that we've held as being, truths, that being emotionally agile is really good. And it is to a point, but I think there's that law of diminishing returns, and then B, well, maybe what we need is this really strong sense of values and being grounded, and we're not just going to continually adjust to everything as it changes in our environment. So that challenges the notions of how we define resilience. It's just, there's so much going on.
Yes, yeah.
I'm just that you asked me about data, and what I have got is we know who's doing it tougher from a resilience and burnout perspective in the professional sort of roles, and whoever's performing the primary caregiving role or home educator role, especially for children under the age of 11, they've been a clear sort of cohort with a higher sort of casualty rate on the burnout side of things. And that is mostly to do with burning the candle at both ends. We hear stories of, and it is usually women getting up at, 3-4 o'clock in the morning to get a good 3 or 4 hours of their paid work in before the children need to then be, put through their paces with various school activities. And they're doing split shifts because then, they get the kids into bed at the end of the day, and then they're sitting down and working at both ends of the day. Clearly not sustainable. There's another fresher angle: those who've got more extroverted personalities, who energize themselves by being around people, they're struggling. They feel depleted and flat. It's not necessarily burnout, but it's an emotional a discomfort that has heightened for them because they're not getting to feed off of the interactions in the workplace. And there is the flip of that. The winners have been, highly structured and organized introverts who perhaps in the office environment were overlooked by their more attention-seeking, slightly noisier colleagues who could kind of get away with spontaneity and impulsivity. But from when we talk to leaders, the pleasant surprises for them have been the number of people who have kind of shone that they hadn't really expected to shine because they're autonomous, independent, very capable, structured, organized. They deliver. They need little in the way of attention. And so it's kind of like if you're an introvert, there's a real opportunity here. This is the era of the introversion and the opportunity to right some wrongs. It really has been a terribly extroverted world until now. But, if as an introvert it's possible for you to channel your compassion for your your extroverted colleagues, as opposed to just thinking it's just desserts for them. That would be a good idea.
So you've shared so much kind of interesting and fascinating insights here. And I'm sure there's going to be so many women listening that kind of relate to what you've shared about the impact on their well-being, or even kind of going, actually, I can relate to some aspects you've talked about with burnout. So what could you share in terms of perhaps some of the coping or prevention strategies that might make a difference to them if they can relate to any of that?
Okay, so right at the top of the list, I'd say impose as much structure, order, and routine into your day as you can. There is a very good reason that clinical psychologists and psychotherapists, recommend structure. They prescribe structure as a treatment for both anxiety and also low mood and depression. So routine, structure, and what that translates to in very practical terms is before you put your feet on the ground in the morning, I would strongly encourage you to mentally just rehearse your game plan for the day. If today is to go as well as it can, even if the context for that is it's suboptimal and it's tough, but for today, within this context that you're operating in at this moment to go well, by the time you go to bed tonight, what will have occurred? And that could be about tasks that need to be done, but it might also be about how you want to be through the day today, that you're going to be someone who doesn't sweat the small stuff. You're going to be someone who rises above the Lego that's all over the floor, or the fact that, people keep phoning you from work and there's 100 voicemails sitting waiting. Just so set your intentions, but rather than keep an intention at this kind of sort of just a values-based level, get it pretty concrete, a game plan. And I think the other sort of stuff I'd mention is around the importance of chunking up your day. If we're left to our natural, both circadian rhythms and also what's called our ultradian rhythms. So the circadian rhythms are whether you're a night owl or a morning lark. Can you use COVID to actually figure the answer out? Because when we were all trying to conform with the standard office hours, we had no choice. But what I've discovered through my COVID experience is I'm absolutely a night owl. So Nikki, when you said you're getting up in time to do a 6 a.m. podcast with me, I was like, oh, I'm so grateful it's the other way around. And I'm doing a 1 a.m. one next week with a colleague in the UK. I'm running a workshop for their organization, and they've got 60 lawyers voting in, or on a virtual thing, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning for me, and they're feeling terrible. And I'm like, no, that's fine, I'll be okay. So you've got to work out what suits you. We're all individuals. Don't bother so much, I think, about what everybody else is doing. Just figure out, what do you need at the moment to A, just keep your head above water, but B, hopefully do a little more than just cope and not be struggling, but to try and get to that more aspirational place of saying, oh, well, I'm going well. I feel good. I feel like I am leading a life that, whilst all these circumstances are outside of my control, I'm actually going well. And I'm still going back to your question around the data. One thing I forgot to say, Nikki, is that before COVID, we used to sort of think that well-being was quite normally distributed, by which I mean 1 in 5, would be thriving and flourishing, and 1 in 5 would be definitely languishing. And by languishing, we mean showing the symptoms, and it could be diagnosed or not diagnosed, but clinically being unwell, physically or mentally unwell. And then we have in the middle this kind of striving to struggling. So it goes thriving, flourishing, moving to striving, where things are kind of okay, but few things have got a bit tougher, you're noticing. And then struggling is probably more where you're beginning to, it might be burnout, but you definitely know you are not yourself, and you're not getting the same enjoyment and satisfaction and happiness and contentment that you usually feel when you're yourself. And then languishing. And what's happened in COVID is, we have got absolute data on this, is that the numbers of people thriving at the top end, they've halved. So it's about 1 in 10 now. But what's really fascinating is the number of people who are reporting that they're languishing has not increased. And I think I've got a little bracket on there, and I'm not being a naysayer or a gloomy person, but I think the bracket is yet. The languishing haven't increased yet. What we don't know what the afterburn is of COVID, what the half-life is of it from a mental health and well-being perspective. But the numbers who are in the middle have gone shooting up. So we have far more people than we've ever seen in the struggling space. So if you're not thriving, you're definitely striving. And those who were striving are shifting into struggling. So the struggling box has become very heavily populated. And it hasn't yet tipped into diagnosable stuff. And that might be because people aren't seeking professional help. I don't know. So
yeah, and I think that's fascinating to hear again. And it's useful to see that kind of framework of thriving, flourishing, striving, struggling, and languishing, just to hold that as kind of a frame of reference. And I'm wondering, people listening going, actually, just from the small insight you've given, where would they put themselves? So,
yeah.
If there was just one thing that you hope a working mother that was listening to this podcast takes away from our conversation, what would you want that to be?
You'll have gathered by now I don't like one thing. Okay, so the thing that I wish I had known or believed was that if I want to make other people happy, and I use that term very loosely, whether that was in a professional setting or with my children or my broader family, then I need to make sure I am making myself happy, in the sense of not, the big word here is martyring. I'm not martyring myself. I'm not doing something for other people because I expect some sort of return on it, or I'm hopeful that something will happen, that I'll get promoted, or that my children will grow up to be perfect and doctors and lawyers. I'm not doing all this because I think I'm going to get it in return. I'm doing it because it's what I want to do at this moment in the present for me right now, because it's aligned with what I want in life. So that's part A of my one thing. And so it's one coin. That's one side of the coin. And on the other side of the same coin is, therefore, both professionally and personally, my wish would be that anybody listening, if you're not already really, really good at articulating what you need and want and expect from other people, and what you need and want and expect of yourself. So, i.e., that's setting your boundaries. If you're not telling people what's okay and what's not okay for you, then the consequence of that is that A, you're likely to be more upset than you need to be when you're disappointed or those things don't happen. And B, it's likely to lead to greater emotional upset and conflict and confusion and aggro from other people. So get really, really good at articulating what you want, not because you want to be some stridently assertive individual, but because it's the single best prevention strategy for depleting your energy unnecessarily down the path when everything or everybody gets upset. So set your boundaries.
Oh, powerful stuff, Audrey. Thank you. So I'm sure people are going to want to find out more about you and your work. So could you share where people are best to go to find out more about you, please?
I sure can. It's not a catchy website, so you have to listen carefully. It's the GLWS. So that's the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey is what it stands for, but glwswellbeing.com. And if you go to there, there's, just as I speak a lot, there's a lot on the website too. But if you go to the blogs, I do blog and I write all my own blogs now. Karen and I used to write them together, but all of that stuff is our thoughts, views, research, and data. And there's a lot of stuff on there that's all free. And if you want to find out about the tool or the other services that we provide, then that's up there as well.
Brilliant. And I'll put the link into the the show notes for everybody as well. But I would highly recommend checking out your blogs. I love receiving your writing because, as I said, there's so much rich kind of and important sharings in there. So thank you, not only for your time, Audrey, but for the work that you're putting out into the world, because it's so important. And I wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Nikki. I feel like it's been a complete indulgence on my part to just kind of sit and go, blah, this is everything that I think is important. And so maybe you'll only have one person listen, but thank you. If you've made it to the end of this podcast, thank you very much.
Oh, I know people are going to love this. I've got a sneaking suspicion this is going to be a very, very highly downloaded episode. So thank you. And thank you for joining me from the other side of the world as well. You
are very welcome. Are you going to go and have some breakfast now?
I am, yes, and get the children ready for school and all of that. Yes. So thank you, Audrey.
Thanks a lot, Nikki.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.